with Mexico. Arizona Border Police discovered a body. And when the agents lifted a tattered t-shirt on the corpse, they found a tattoo that read, Dayani Cristal. And there was no other identification. The compassionate staff at the county morgue's office began the all too frequent investigation trying to identify yet another migrant who died in this desert. A film director and a Mexican activist became interested, or they began let me start all over. A film director and a Mexican activist became interested in this forensic investigation, and they followed it from the very beginning with finding the body to the end. And in 2010, they made an award-winning documentary that's worth seeing, and it's titled, Who is Dayani Cristal? Because this migrant had entered the U.S. before, the investigators were eventually able to identify him, and the film director was able to trace this 29-year-old man's path from his home in Honduras to the exact spot where he died. His story's a familiar one. He left Honduras hoping to give his family a better life. He went into debt to pay a human smuggler to take him to the U.S., traveling for 58 days to get to the U.S. border. Then he had a 4-day walk across the desert in an area called the Corridor of Death. This young man died of dehydration with swollen, blistered, and bleeding feet. And his name was Johann Sandres Martinez. He had a small daughter named Dayani Cristal. I frequently hear people say, why don't such migrants just come here legally? I hear people say this as if they think these migrants deliberately choose to come illegally when they could have just been patient and got in line. Yet who in their right mind would do what Johann did? if he had a choice. He didn't come legally because he couldn't. So the question is, why not? At least for him to have a chance. And to look at some aspects of this country's immigration policies provides an answer, and it highlights just how inhumane, exploitative, immoral, unethical, and well, I need some stronger adjectives to describe this country's immigration policies. Because of time, I'm not going to talk about the unfair scapegoating of the immigrant, making them the other who's to blame for society's ills, the criminalization of them, or the xenophobic, racist language we so often hear, all real concerns in violation of our first principle, the worth and dignity of all. But the policies are also in violation of this principle, and I will focus here. Of course, we know about the immorality and the shame of separating children from migrant parents. So I won't spend much time here, except to stress that not all children have been united, not all are likely to be. Now, it's not new at all to separate children, but the zero tolerance policy of the current administration meant more migrants were in detention. Also, what was new was the appalling record keeping. Hotels with coat rooms do a better job of keeping track of coats in their charge. In addition, the wholesale detention of asylum seekers and the removal of their children was new. The asylum seekers came through a legal entry point. They followed the law. It is egregious to detain the asylum seekers, essentially putting them in prison and kidnapping their children. And you may know that the administration is now threatening to reinstitute the family separation policy. Another policy that's been in the news a lot lately concerns the Dreamers, who were brought here illegally as small children and are now young adults. Leaders in both political parties promised this group they would pass legislation to let them legally remain here. But the dreamers became political pawns, and leaders reneged on this promise. Unless Congress acts or the courts give a definitive favorable ruling, all will be deported, and many have already been. The wait for those who remain in this country is excruciating. To so callously play with the lives of others is immoral. Now let's look at a few other programs some may not be as familiar with. First, the U.S. Guest Worker Program, which I think is hopelessly flawed. This program is designed to bring needed, unskilled, and skilled workers here on a temporary basis. So why couldn't someone like Johan apply to come here under this program? He couldn't. It just doesn't work that way. Now, before explaining the program, stick with me. Let's go back in history to 1965, when the federal government ended a long-standing immigration program. And then they instituted strict quotas on the number of visas allowed in this guest worker program. For example, in the agricultural seasonal guest worker program, the maximum number of workers allowed in 1965, when they set up the program, was 66,000 per year. According to the book Undocumented by Chomsky and oh so many other sources, all involved knew this number was wildly out of sync with the demand that certain industries had. They knew that these industries would have to rely on undocumented to get the jobs done. Well, as expected, the undocumented population skyrocketed in the 60s and then into the 70s. Now, if I were a cynic, I might speculate that some of these big businesses wanted a low quota because they could then hire the undocumented at a cheaper rate. Yet I don't know that for a fact, but I do agree with the Unitarian Universalist College of Social Justice that the U.S. knowingly created a system which required, maybe even encouraged, illegal immigration to meet the needs of businesses and farms in the United States. Okay, now with the guest worker program, migrants can't just apply for one of these visas. Instead, a U.S. employer must apply to the government for workers for a specific job and a specific period of time. Employers advertise in other countries, recruit workers who come and can only work for them. And there's certainly some good employers in this program. But I believe the program, at least for the unskilled workers, sets up a situation vulnerable to abuse. Many workers begin their employment indebted to employers who charge fees for them to even apply. Once in the U.S., these workers face unrealistic productivity requirements, horrible living and working conditions, and lower wages than promised. Of course, it's difficult for them to complain. If they lose their job, they will be deported. The Southern Poverty Law Center claims the guest worker program for the unskilled is akin to slavery. In their book entitled Close to Slavery, the authors write, far from being treated as guests, these workers are systematically exploited and abused. Now, this is not true for all, but it's true. We don't know of how many, but it's certainly true of some. The Southern Poverty Law Center writes the conditions they endure is nothing short of horrifying. One example given in the book is the seafood workers who were forced to work 80-hour weeks, work until their hands went numb, and who were threatened with beatings and deportations if they stopped working. The Southern Poverty Law Center maintains that employers who get these visas have little supervision and accountability. The government maintains that accountability is rigorous. But since very few workers complain, it's hard to know. Successful court cases against an employer are rare, but they do happen, and they alert us to the exploitation. For example, in 2006, a recruiting firm hired 550 workers in India to come here and help in shipyards after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. The potential workers, or the workers that were hired, had to pay 20,000 US dollars for this privilege. Not unusual. They were falsely promised permanent resident status in the United States. These poor, uneducated men somehow or another raised the money and came. Once here, they had to share a trailer with over 20 other men, live in guarded labor camps, and work for lower wages than promised. Their situation only became known when they protested and went on public hunger strikes. The Southern Poverty Law Center went to court on their behalf, suing the employer for breach of promise. And after a 7-year court battle, the workers won. An unprecedented, epic win. But by then, lives had been ruined. The guest worker program for the unskilled migrants is broken. It needs to be replaced. Now, let's look at the largest and most coveted visa program in the United States. This is a program where migrants can directly apply to come here and live permanently with a path to citizenship. According to the State Department tally, there are more than 4.4 million people on the waiting list for this program. This is the waiting list, not the number who will be admitted. Most of these 4.4 million are sponsored by a family member in the U.S. who must either be a citizen or have a permanent residence card, better known as a green card. Having a family member does not mean those on this list will be admitted anytime within the next 2 or 3 decades, according to the foundation, the National Foundation of American Policy. There's a priority system in place, as there should be. For example, the minor child of a spouse of a U.S. citizen gets priority. And chances are good that this person, the spouse or minor child, could come within 1, maybe 2 years, depending upon their country of origin, because there is a quota system per country. But let's say a father wants to come and help raise his children. His wife, who sponsors him, has a green card, a permanent resident card, not citizenship. Depending on his country of origin, this wait could easily be 10 years. Let's say an adult son wants to migrate here to take care of aging parents with green cards. The wait for this category could be 30 years. The same or longer for adult siblings. Well, this tremendous backlog in processing visa applications puts families in the painful position of having to choose whether to follow the law and be separated for years, break the law, be together, but live with the risk of deportation, go back to the home country and live with the fear of violence or dire poverty. All the options result in broken dreams. Now, one category of this program that's not tied to family sponsorship is for skilled and unskilled workers. Let's go back to Johann. He could have applied for one of the unskilled visas, but his chances of being approved were right around 0. The quota for this category is a total of 5,000 per year. And the waiting list is already so long that it will take decades for just the existing applicants to be approved according to the foundation of American policy. And the wait for skilled workers from certain countries can also be decades. Oh no, we have a broken system. Yet we keep processing these visa applications, taking $535 every time, knowing the majority will never be admitted. It is dishonest, but mostly it's cruel to keep lives on hold. Well, I've mentioned the two major visa programs in the United States, but there are others. And some of the changes in these other programs break my heart, particularly a recent one in the military. The military recruited immigrants with certain skills to come here, serve in the military. And many came with great personal cost. We promised them a path to citizenship if they did this. And then our government callously reneged on this promise. Well, there are just too many other policies to discuss, and I think you get the picture of the unjust system we have. So let's talk about solutions to our inhumane policies. And it is imperative that we focus on real and practical solutions, ones that have a chance of being enacted. For decades, Congress has promised reform, but not acted. It's immoral to do nothing when we bear some culpability for the mass migration from Mexico and Central America. We are culpable of encouraging illegal entry, of overthrowing left-wing governments, of passing NAFTA, which put 2 million Mexican farmers out of work, according to the Center for International Policy. The U.S. market for illegal drug use is at least partially responsible for the corruption and violent drug gangs in Mexico and Central America. We helped create the problem, and it's immoral for us as a nation to continue locking up those who grow our crops, build our houses, work in our hotels, meat packing industries, and oh, so much more without doing something to fix our broken system. I think the first criterion for judging solutions is that they must be sane. Yes, it sounds ridiculous, but you know it's not a criterion always followed. For example, it is insane to talk about deporting 11 to 12 million undocumented. It would be impossible and economically devastating. Instead of talk of deporting the undocumented, let's provide the law-abiding a way to legally stay. Let them come out of the shadows and become full members of our country. It's also insane to have a program with a backlog of 4.4 million and horrendously long wait lines. Let's fix it. Let's change it. Let's be honest and not give people false hope. The second criterion, I think, for assessing solutions is that they must use our government resources wisely. For example, according to a CNN 2018 article, Immigration and Customs Enforcement has the resources to arrest, detain, and deport only roughly 150,000 to 200,000 individuals per year. This meant previous administrations focused on finding immigrants, primarily finding immigrants guilty of violent offenses, smuggling, distributing drugs. To spend these precious resources on arresting law-abiding undocumented workers means the focus is no longer on those with violent offenses. The raids, the knocks at the door in the middle of the night, looking for easy prey without papers is not a good use of limited resources. Of course, if the millions of law-abiding undocumented were given a path to citizenship, then enforcement could focus on these violent offenders. I am no Pollyanna, and I do not support open borders. I know there are violent immigrants here. Sometimes they're the very people that so many immigrants came to avoid. So let's be realistic. Let's focus on stopping them from coming in and finding those who are here. This would make us safer. It's not a good use of resources, not to mention an inhumane one, to pay for-profit prison companies $159 a day per detainee, when ankle bracelets could be used for about $4 a day, according to the Week magazine. And it costs $750 a day to detain each child in the large tent cities that have been recently erected. What an abuse of resources. It also makes no sense to use our resources to turn our borders into war zones. And actually, I think when we do this, we increase the number of undocumented living in this country. According to Fortune magazine, in the 1960s, 70 million Mexicans crossed in the United States without documents. Did I say in the 1960s? Yes. But in time, 85% of those returned home. Many stayed, but some came back, coming and going for seasonal work. Yes, unauthorized, but possible. Yet people are too afraid to do this anymore, so they are remaining in the United States. According to the book Undocumented, such militarization or having a border wall can change where people try to cross and determine how many will die in the process. But it has little effect on the number of people crossing. Fiscal conservatives should be screaming about the exorbitant and wasteful use of resources. Of course, we all know that the most important criterion for judging solutions is that they must be humane. To have humane policies, we must change the guest worker program, have more employer accountability. There are options, such as ones proposed by a coalition of U.S. farmers that would give employers a predictable supply of labor and give workers more protection. In addition to the guest worker program changes, we must have more avenues for low or unskilled immigrants to legally enter to meet the needs of our economy, find work independently, and come and go as the job requires. The U.S. needs immigrants as much as they need us. To have humane policies, we must fulfill our promise to the dreamers and provide them a way to become citizens. These are just a few, very few examples of the many, many changes needed. Having policies and enforcement that treat people with respect and dignity is not too much to demand of our government. So what can we do? Hard. One thing we can do is continue to support the National Unitarian Universalist Association. They have taken laudable action on this issue. They're a leading public witness for moral policies. They've helped arrange sponsors for asylum seekers. They help churches provide sanctuary to people appealing deportation orders. They actively work to improve the lives of immigrants and so much more. We can support other organizations. One I support that help the undocumented is called No More Deaths, and it's sponsored by the UU Church of Tucson. Among other things, volunteers bring water, socks, first aid supplies to the desert where Johann died and leave them, even though at times this meant they have been arrested. The National Immigrant Justice Center is a wonderful organization that helps fight legal battles for the undocumented. There are so many people, so many groups who care passionately about this, and we can join them. Overall, we must educate ourselves and individually become an advocate, a witness for moral immigration policies. I understand that many people think there's little that we can do given the current political climate. Yet, the recent public outrage over the separation of children from parents was what made the difference. The collective of those individual voices helped change that practice, and we can do that again. It's a lesson for us all that at least at times our voices can matter, whether it's contacting your congressional representatives, participating in a demonstration, or just talking to neighbors and friends. I close now with words by the Reverend John Polvovich. Our country is experiencing a real-life human rights emergency generated by our elected officials, many claiming faith in a dark-skinned refugee Jesus, while allowing migrant families to be ripped apart, quoting the Bible while they do it. If there was ever a time when the church should be visible and vocal, it should be now. What use is religion if not to rescue the most vulnerable from the most powerful, if not to advocate for the least of these, if not to care for their neighbor as themselves? May this be so. May we work to make it so. Amen.